All right, everybody, welcome tonight to our part 2, Facing Invaders, a WOW discussion on invasives. We're really excited to have you all join us. And this is kind of a start of programs that we're doing. We're calling learning circles. We're just starting this. We're going to learn more about them in the next year. And it's sort of more of a discussion and a sharing after a little bit of learning. And really excited tonight to again be talking about invasives, because at this time of year, that's when you can really pick them out and start doing something. You know, I've been pulling garlic mustard because so we're going to learn a little bit tonight, first about 20 minutes, and then depending on the size of the group, looks like right now we might stay as one group or we'll split into 2 groups for some just discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrea Shortsleeve with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, one of our WOW steering committee members. We have a few other steering committee members on. We'll meet them again when we go break out into the breakout rooms. But we're all also learning and experiencing our own headaches with these invasives. So we'll share those with you as well as part of the discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrea, and tonight we're going to learn a little bit more about knotweed and barberry and bittersweet. But in our discussions, we can talk just about anything. So Andrea, take it away.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Oh no, it says host has disabled participant sharing. So unless you guys just want to look at my face.
Did not. There you go.
Perfect. Okay. So we'll share that. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. Okay. Great. So like Lisa said, my name's Andrea. I work for the Fish and Wildlife Department here, and I work with private landowners. So I've worked with a few of you. Tonight we're going to talk about a couple more invasives. We're going to talk about barberry, garlic mustard, and knotweed. The last session, if you joined us, we talked mostly about honeysuckle and buckthorn. But before we get into those species, I just want to do a quick review, a couple main points about invasives, how to prioritize treatment of them, and then we'll get into the specific species. So just real briefly to remind us of why we do not like invasives in our woods. They create a lot of different habitat concerns. They change ecological processes and suppress native plants. So that can mean they change fire regimes out west if there's a fire pattern out there, and they also change successional patterns here in our woods. They often create monocultures, which we know are bad for our forests. Everything likes a little biodiversity. A lot of the seeds that these invasives produce are really low in nutrients, and that is a real problem for a lot of these songbirds that come up here to Vermont, try to get fat and healthy for their migration down south to Central and South America in the winter. These berries are not nutritious, and they are often diuretics. So the birds use up a lot of energy and don't gain anything back when they feed on them. And actually, there's been some studies that have shown that cardinals, after feeding on honeysuckle berries, actually lose the color of their plumage because they're so low in nutrients that the plumage is not bright enough, and they do not breed because of that. Invasive plants also are not hosts to native insects, which is another issue for a lot of our native birds. They specifically feed on caterpillars and insects that are hosted on our native plants. And when we have a forest full of invasives, we don't have our native insects. So they create a lot of different issues. This is a slide Nancy had in her presentation a couple of weeks ago, and it's just a really good reminder of prevention is the cheapest solution when it comes to invasives. So in early identification, being able to ID plants that are moving into the area. So kind of like we were talking about when you first signed in, learning about new invasives in the area. It's really important because these plants are such prolific seed spreaders and do a really good job of expanding their range, that with just a few plants in the landscape, they can exponentially increase very quickly. So being familiar with the plants that we have is incredibly important. It can be very overwhelming to have invasive plants on your property, as I'm sure you know. and having a plan and a method to identify how you're going to manage these plants is important. The slide here shows with the different circles one way of treating invasive plants and trying to decide a prioritization of how you're working with them. And it recommends looking at areas where there's a low density of invasives where you can remove those, and then moving into a higher density and kind of pushing back that perimeter of the infestation as you go. It's really helpful, we've found, to establish some photo points of where you have high infestations on your property, so you can go back and take a measured mark of how that invasive is moving through your forest or your property. The diagram on the right here kind of shows that and shows a kind of a picture of a garlic mustard infestation on someone's property, and identifies how they're going to focus on those different areas. So some questions you want to ask yourself when you're looking at invasives on your property is what do I have? What kind of species do I have? How much do I have of each species? Oftentimes you can have a really big infestation of one species and only have a couple individuals of another species, and you want to make sure those few individuals don't get lost, because those are really easy to take care of before they spread, and then you have two infestations on your hands. And then the third question is what do you want? That can be kind of a difficult question, or it can be really easy sometimes for some landowners. What are you actually managing for? Are you managing for spring ephemerals? Are you managing for native pollinators? And that can really help you kind of pick your area and prioritization of where you're going to begin your treatment of invasive plants on your property. And then just a couple other things as you're getting started looking at how you're going to manage things on your land. You know, going through a prioritization like I showed on the last slide of heavy infestation and outwards is a really good idea, or excuse me, where the light infestation is and then moving inwards is a good idea. But I also really recommend, if you have a couple shrubs, couple big trees that are producing a lot of berries, I would go tackle those as soon as you can, because that's where the seed source is coming from. And if you can get those out of the way, you're just going to be helping yourself down the road. It's also really important to make sure that you're surveying areas where invasives are going to be moving in and getting familiar with those areas, such as roads, trails, waterways, and then also newly opened areas. If you have a timber harvest or a patch cut or something like that, those are going to be great areas for birds to move in and drop invasive seeds. So being familiar with areas where new invaders are going to be coming in is going to help you down the road as well. I'm sure you all know that invasive plants don't really care about boundaries. And if you're doing a lot of work and your neighbor isn't, it's going to be a lot more work for you. So another priority when you're working with invasive plants is to get friendlies with your neighbor and talk about their management plan. And then lastly, just another reminder of keep your focus on what you're managing for rather than against. If you're solely focused on eradicating the invasive plants on your property, you're going to get pretty frustrated pretty quickly. So if you can kind of change the perspective and keep a focus on the native plants that maybe you're focusing on, or the songbirds that you're trying to improve the habitat for, that's going to kind of keep things in perspective and hopefully not make it such a difficult task as you're trying to fight these invasive plants. So we will start and talk about barberry, which is bright and green and lovely right now at this time of year. There's two different species that we have in our forests, Japanese and common barberry, and they look a little different, but management of them is the same. So I'm just going to talk about them basically at the same time. A really easy telltale sign of these plants is the thorny spines that are attached to the stems. The Japanese barberry has a single spine, and the common one has three attached to each of the branches or along the branches. They grow in kind of like a mounding, brambly kind of style. That's really easy to identify when you're out in the woods. And they have these red kind of dangly berries that look very enticing, and those are easy to identify as well when you're out in the woods. Both of these have been used in landscaping, and the Japanese barberry especially turns kind of a lovely red during the fall, and that's also helps with identification as you're looking for this plant. You're going to see these mostly in disturbed areas along the forest edges, and kind of moving into the interior forest, beginning on the edge and moving in that way. And this plant is spread mostly by wildlife, by birds, grouse, turkey, eating those berries and then depositing them at the next perch. One thing that is really important to know about barberry is that because of the way that it grows in these dense thickets, it provides a really great refuge for mice, which are hosts for the black-legged tick. So the more that the mice hang out in these brambly patches, the ticks jump off in these areas. And what some studies in Connecticut by UConn and the extension service there have found that barberry infestations in the forest have much higher levels of ticks than in areas outside of areas that are infested with barberry, to the point where the areas with the barberry have 120 infected ticks with Lyme disease per acre versus outside where there's only about 10 ticks with Lyme disease per acre. So it's a huge difference. And if that's not motivation to get rid of your barberry, I don't know what is. So treating barberry, all of the methods have been tried, and most of them work pretty well. If you have a small infestation, mechanical can work. If you have a weed wrench and getting the roots out, because of those thorns, they're pretty hard to hand pull. They're not really fun. You can use a targeted foliar spray or cut stump application. And barberry also responds really well in terms of it poorly. It doesn't like fire. You can use a directed flame on barberry that way. But what researchers have found is that a two-step combination is really best with this plant. So one, either doing a mechanical cut, lopping off the top of everything above the ground, and then following it up with either a fire or a chemical application is the best way to really make sure that these guys aren't coming back. And so Vermontinvasivesorg has for all of these species that I'm talking about, they have great treatment sheets that show what time of year is best for what method of these plants. And so I've just highlighted that on here. Really, barberry, you can take care of it most any time of the year. So anytime you have time to get out there, I recommend it. One thing that we've been trying to talk about a lot with invasive plants and treating them is that that's only part of the treatment is getting rid of them, and the second part is replacing them with native alternatives to fill in those gaps that you're creating when you're removing the invasive plants. And so some native alternatives for barberry is winterberry or either nannyberry. Both have great food. They're both great food sources in the late fall and into the winter for wildlife. And they're both very attractive, winterberry especially. I have a couple at my house and they're gorgeous. So moving on to garlic mustard, which is a little bit of a different beast. It's more of a herbaceous invasive rather than the ones that we've talked about already with buckthorn and honeysuckle and barberry. Those are all kind of woody invasives that you're going to find in the forest, and the management is just a little different because of that. Garlic mustard is pretty easy to identify, especially right now. It's out in full force. It can fool you because it looks like a nice, attractive flower, and it is not. It's easily identified when you crush the leaves. It smells like garlic, which is where it gets its name. Also, when you pull it, it has an S-shaped taproot, which is very a good signifier, a good identifier of what that plant is. Garlic mustard is a little tricky because it's a biennial plant. So the first year that it's in the ground, it'll pop up as a rosette. So just leaves and getting energy in that taproot for the next year. And that's when it's going to flower and grow to be about 4 feet tall and use all its energy and spread. It has a lot of seeds each year, and that's basically how it moves throughout your property. You're going to find it also in disturbed areas again, forest edges. And one thing that is pretty sneaky about garlic mustard is that it's allelopathic, which means that it produces a chemical into the soil that eliminates any other plants around it. So it not only is it such a good spreader, good by the seeds, a good invader, that it also makes sure that it has no competition by chemically kind of reducing that population. And just wanted to make a note that, one thing that's really kind of not nice about garlic mustard is that it is toxic to West Virginia white butterfly caterpillars, which is a species of concern here in Vermont. They normally lay their eggs on a toothwort, a native toothwort plant that we have, but because of the chemical composition and the allelopathic, tendencies of this plant, it confuses the caterpillars, and the caterpillars end up laying their eggs on this, and it's toxic, and or the butterflies lay the eggs and the caterpillars eat it, and it's just kind of a bad scene. So treating garlic mustard, the most important thing is to do it before the plant flowers and before it goes to seed. So right now, if you have some time and you see some garlic mustard, I would get on it right now before it goes to seed. Hand pulling is one of the most impactful ways that you can treat and try to manage this species, but make sure that you get the entire taproot out when you pull it. Otherwise, you're gonna leave some energy in there and it'll sprout out again. Hand pulling is also good when you have infestations that are mixed in among other native plants that you can kind of pick and choose and pull like you're weeding in a garden. Flame weeding is effective for patches of like the small rosettes, but only in the spring. It's kind of the best time to do that. And then of course, foliar application of a chemical spray is also very effective. And you can do that before other plants are out, usually in April. And again, I really recommend this only when it's a big clump and it's only a monoculture of garlic mustard. That way you're not gonna hit any non-targets. And using a low volume backpack sprayer minimizes that drift, and it's the best way to do a chemical application for this species. One important note is that it's really crucial that you make sure that you dispose of these plants after you pull them properly. So either burning them or bagging them in a garbage bag and taking them to the dump. Don't put them in the compost. Don't leave them out in the woods, because those seeds stay viable for a long time even after pulling, and the fragments will resprout as well. So some native alternatives, if you have these in an area where you'd like flowers, the native foam flower and then common boneset are good kind of choices to replace garlic mustard with. They both attract a lot of pollinators, and they both have the same color, white flower. And now to Japanese knotweed, which I think is one of the trickiest invaders that we have on our landscape. It's pretty sneaky. It's commonly found along waterways and roadsides and disturbed areas, and especially in Vermont, it really blew up after Hurricane Irene. And part of that was because a lot of the repairs from the hurricane and from the storm was using soil and dirt that had knotweed in it. And that's how it got spread along a lot of our waterways and roadsides as things got repaired. It spreads via rhizomes, so underground roots or stems, and just 5 grams of the plant is needed for it to regrow. And it grows quickly, and it is persistent, and it's really hard to eradicate. So being aware of an early invader, of this is really, really important. And we'll do do you a lot of good down the road if you are able to identify this early. It just has a lot of, because it creates such a dense monoculture with that bamboo stem underneath, it has a lot of pretty negative impacts on wildlife in the ecosystem. And over in Great Britain and in the UK, where knotweed is a huge problem, it costs a lot of money because it's getting into the foundations and infrastructure of their buildings over there, to the point where it's difficult to get home insurance if you have knotweed in your yard or in your neighborhood. So we hopefully won't get to that point here. And so one of the reasons that knotweed is so difficult to treat is because it has this extensive root rhizome system underneath, and it's huge. And that picture on the left there, it's really kind of like that iceberg diagram that you'll always see. A tip of the iceberg is above water, but the majority of the iceberg is under. And that's the same with knotweed. The majority of the energy in the plant is underground, and it has a ton of energy reserves there. Then there's a picture of it poking up through pavement, which is pretty remarkable that a plant can do that. The most effective treatment for knotweed is a manual, just digging it up. If you have a small infestation, digging it up and removing as much of the root system as you possibly can. If you can't do that, I know a lot of people have, especially if you have any kind of riparian property, riverside property, you're going to have a large infestation, and digging it all out is not necessarily an easy task. So some landowners have had success with a chemical stem injection. So basically using a small syringe and injecting the stems of the knotweed with glyphosate. And again, it's labor intensive, but it seems to have the best results to get rid of knotweed, minimize it as much as you can. Some people have tried smothering knotweed using like triple layer UV plastic or geotextile fabric, and there hasn't been a lot of long-term success demonstrated in these methods yet. It's very expensive, and it's a lot of very high maintenance, and requires a lot of monitoring, mostly because either the fabric or the plastic can get ripped, and any kind of sunlight that gets in underneath that smothering cover will just enhance the knotweed. Also, these guys, this plant has such a reserve in the rhizomes that it can extend 7 meters beyond, where the plastic is laid. So you need to make this covering a lot bigger than you think, and it needs to be laid down with very heavy objects that aren't going to get moved throughout the year during the winter and all the different seasons. So this is, again, another really time-intensive method that hasn't been proven to work super well. There's a kind of a newer method that's being talked about a lot. There's a company over in England that has patented some of this technology, but it's been used in several different areas in the States as well, using a hardware cloth or a wire mesh over the knotweed patch to basically try to trick the plant into continuing to grow using its energy reserves from the rhizome, pokes up through the hardware cloth, and as the stems grow, they get girdled and can never produce leaves and chlorophyll and eventually killing the energy supply of the plant. It takes a couple of years, from what I've heard from people around the state who have tried it so far. It's working okay. It's kind of a trial and error right now. The Missisquoi River Basin Association is using it in a couple areas up in their neck of the woods and have had some success on small patches, but they've found that if you elevate the mesh above the ground, it's a little more helpful than if you just lay the mesh right on the plant, as in that picture with the guy in the orange. It just seems to trigger the plant differently. Other considerations, if you're using this, is it's really helpful you need to cut down the stalks dispose of those stalks from the overwintering plant, dispose of them properly. So again, burning them or taking them to the landfill, and then placing the mesh immediately after that. So yeah, if anyone's tried this, it'd be great to hear your success or lessons learned from that. And then some alternatives to knotweed, really anything. Anything's better than knotweed, but elderberry and milkweed are some great substitutes, especially along kind of river and open areas that knotweed seems to be prolific in. And then just as a reminder for some invasive resources that we often recommend to landowners, Vermontinvasivesorg is a great website. Not only do they have treatment plans and identifying characteristics for all of the invasives that I've talked about and other ones, they also have a great list of native plants to use as alternatives to replace these invasives. Go Botany is another great website to help you identify different plants that are in the area so you can become familiar with what's invasive, what's not, what's normal. The invasive.org is in the Global Invasive Species team is another website that has some great resources to help you develop a management plan for invasive plants. Nancy talked about it in our last webinar, and you can revisit that in the recording if you're interested. And then finally, just a little plug for the Forest Hero program that's run through FPR and Vermont Coverts to help educate and become kind of ambassadors of invasive plants and or against invasive plants, I should say. Lisa can talk a little bit more about that if I'm not doing a good job covering it, but those are kind of the main resources that we have available. As we talk in the group, I'd be interested to know what other resources people are using to become familiar or, with different treatments and different methods of managing invasive plants. So I guess with that, here's a nice picture of not invasive plants. And I guess we'll open up to the discussion unless anyone has some questions for me.
All right, before we do that, I have a little poll